Good evening. It's amazing how with these lights I can't see a thing out in the crowd. That's pretty blurry. So my name is Jay Salakin. I am the coordinator of technology with Saskatoon Public Schools. I am terrible at riffing, so I wrote something that I thought I would just read so that I don't make a fool of myself up here. So I'll maybe go a little after, but so welcome. And tonight we have the pleasure of having Dr. Alec Couros and Coralee Pringle-Nelson with us to talk about raising youth in the 21st century. So this is the third year we've done this. We did it at Bowman first year, Tommy Douglas last year, and then here this year. So we'll start with Alec. So Alec will come up and talk about social media and many of the behaviors of youth. And then we'll switch to Coralee, who will talk about developing brains of young people and some strategies to help us raise those young minds. So we'll start with Alec. So Alec is a professor of educational technology and media with the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina and is widely recognized as a pioneer in the area of open education. In his 23 years as an educator, Alec has worked as a teacher, youth worker, educational administrator, IT coordinator, consultant, professor with employment in K-12 schools, justice facilities, technical institutes, and universities. He's an engaging speaker and with a wealth of knowledge in current social media trends and behaviors of youth. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alec Couros.
So for a second I thought Jay said I was an engineer, and I actually was an engineer. I used to my summer job was the kiddie train at Kismet Park Ride. That was my engineering side. That was the best summer job you could have possibly imagined. I hope you can hear me okay. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I'm so glad to see so many parents. I can kind of see you, but I see a lot of people here who are probably concerned and wondering about what their kids are doing online. This is just the beginning of a conversation, I hope. Perhaps this is something that you can extend with Saskatoon Public Schools or beyond. And of course, at the end, I'll give you my email address. So if you have any specific questions, you can certainly send an email to me, and I'm very happy just to reply in any way I want from one parent to another. So a bit more about me. That's me. I have a fairly expanded social media presence. I've been on social media since it's been around, and I use it in my everyday profession. So social media, I want to certainly convince you that it's not necessarily all a time waster. Certainly lots of it is, but a lot of it has to do with my everyday work. I couldn't do what I do on a daily basis in terms of research and teaching if it wasn't for social media. So there is really a reason out there to have it. I also write policy. I wrote the Saskatchewan Digital Citizenship Guide, policy guide. So I like to inform and help governments understand policy as well as working with school divisions as well. And I also work a lot with youth. Tomorrow I'm at Evan Hardy, I believe, working with 850 students and helping them to understand how to be better online as well and to be much more safer than perhaps they are at the moment. I also have 4 kids. One of them's here. If you notice back here, this is actually my daughter, Bia, and this is the first time she's seen me actually in a presentation. Hi. So she's 7, she's a tech whiz, always doing such amazing things, and she's also there, the singer in the bottom. If you want to do your makeup online, she has some great YouTube tutorials if you want to check it out. So we're not afraid of social media, but at the same time, we're very cautious in terms of what we put out, what we do, and sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, but I think at the end of the day, technology isn't going away. It's something that we have to certainly learn more about as parents. And so I think thinking about this journey as an eyes wide open journey, and certainly one that you take in step with your kids, is really incredibly important. And I think the major theme tonight is going to be certainly that this is a relationship starting with your kids. It's not just about knowing how to get ahead of them or how they can trick you in terms of using their tools. It's really quite important that we talk to them. So our kids' digital realities, and we think back to the way that we might view technology. And Douglas Adams was the author of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and he talked about how we often look at technology in retrospect. So for us, anything in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary and just a natural part of the way the world works. That's when we think about technology. Anything that's invented between the time you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting. revolutionary, and you can probably get a career in it. And this is all the things that you might be seeing in the news these days. But after about the time you're 35, everything you see just seems like against the natural order of things. So if you don't quite get Snapchat, or if you don't get some of the tools that your kids might be using, it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a generational thing. Over time, we just don't find these things valuable as much as perhaps the kids might see them, and for many, it's their future. Many of us in the room started in the era of computers. You might have done print shop. Like, you couldn't get in trouble doing print shop other than running, maybe getting a paper cut and, running out a box and paper. We did ColecoVision, and my mother's here as well, which is kind of awesome. She told me from a young age that if I went to the arcade in Humboldt, I grew up in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, that I couldn't go to there because people would sell me drugs. And I don't know if you would remember that, Mom, but so that's like one of the reasons I had a ColecoVision, so I could stay away from the arcade. Bad place, apparently. The rise of connectivity and mobility in the 1990s really happened, and certainly about 1993, 1994, you saw Mosaic, and the world really changed. We could connect to people in a much more graphical way. There was ways of connecting to people beyond that, but of course, around the 1990s, you started to see IRC chat, ICQ, AOL Instant Messenger, and as parents, that generation, people got scared because all of a sudden you could be talking to strangers online. And this was a really important time, certainly. And I remember back then, we really tried to scare kids off the internet. This is when my teaching career began. I saw posters like this all around, and it was convincing kids that whoever they're talking to online is probably not the person that you're talking to, and it could be an online predator or someone else. And there was some reality. It was certainly overblown at the time. And we certainly don't know, and I think things have taken a new twist in this reality, that a lot of the people online is not necessarily predators, but they might be bots, for instance. They might be people that aren't even real, controlled by other forces. But it's an interesting time to be alive, certainly. A friend of mine in Texas bought T-shirts for his staff to make sure that kids understand, that they may not be talking to someone online that they think that they might be. From current social media from the 2000s, this is where we sort of sit with your kids. They're most likely probably have left if they were ever on Facebook. Kids are certainly leaving Facebook in droves, but Instagram is really hot still. Twitter, not so much, but the other one, of course, is Snapchat. Now, Snapchat was cool until about 3 days ago, until I think Khloe Kardashian said that it wasn't cool anymore, and so the stock dropped, and so who knows what's going to happen with Snapchat. But it's something to know about. Kids, for the most part, when it came out, it was known to be the sexting app. And this scared a lot of people. And certainly people did use it to send intimate images. But for the most part, most people that I know don't use it. They use it for, put filters on their face, make funny faces, send images. But for the most part, just send things that will not necessarily be on your Facebook feed forever. And one of the things that's nice about Snapchat is, yes, everything is permanent and it's forever, and you should treat everything as it is, that it's probably stored somewhere. For the most part, it gives a bit of a relief from everything being permanent. And that's why a lot of young people certainly flock to it, because it seems less permanent than other spaces, when perhaps in reality it's not. So learning more about that is important, but also there's a number of messaging apps. So you might see these on your phone. There's certainly regular old texting, but there's Kik, things like Kik, WhatsApp, FaceTime certainly, and a few other ones out there that you probably see from time to time. The trick with a lot of these is, even if you try to monitor what's happening, these are highly encrypted, and the messages, you could tell if you're using software whether your kid is using one of these, but you can't necessarily see what they're sending. There's a purpose for this. There's encrypted messages that are not to be retrieved by others, and so it's very difficult, really impossible for you to see what's actually happening. You can't monitor these in any real way, and we'll talk about that in a bit more. And there's also anonymous messaging app, which come and go, and you often see them in the media. The latest one is something called Saraha, and basically the idea is you have a web page that allows people to post anonymous messages. And in many cases, when you're in a teen culture, these are very flattering, or they're very they can be very detrimental to your health. They're slanderous, they're mean-spirited, they're just not very nice. And so you often see these things come in the news because they can often be used for bullying. And for the most part, kids volunteer to be bullied, I guess, in some ways by using them in some ways. So I think thinking about these tools and why kids might use these, what motivates them to use it, but just in the overall understanding what's out there is really important. The other thing that I get called by principals a lot is live streaming apps. We often talk about the idea of think before you post, and that we should, before we type that in, that we have some time to think about it and think if it's appropriate. And I think that's certainly good practice and something we need to be teaching kids. The thing with live streaming, like right now, I'm being live streamed. If I say something off, something not so good, that's on my permanent record forever. And kids have this capability. Rather than having a studio, they have this in their pocket that they can live stream to like potentially millions of people at any given time. It's instantly recorded. That's a lot of responsibility, and it certainly gets a lot of kids in trouble in many cases. So some of the big things to know before we kind of move on, just as a sort of introduction, is certainly almost every tool has some sort of private messaging capabilities. One of the first things I tell kids if they're using Instagram, because it's very common, is turn off the ability to the messaging or totally ignore the messaging function in Instagram. It's often filled with spam, often filled with people that you don't want to necessarily talk to. And of course, try to make your accounts private. All posts can be made permanent. Something I'll certainly be talking about to kids tomorrow. All posts can be shared locally or globally, like everything is out there. Anonymous apps empower and disempower users. There is a reason to have anonymous apps, but it's often not necessarily something that most kids would need. And obviously nothing is truly anonymous. Even when you think you're anonymous, you probably aren't. There's a lot of clues that you're giving away. Everything, of course, is on your permanent record, a scary thing to think about. And of course, all tools can be used positively or negatively. And I think that's something that we have to help instill with kids, is to understand that there's a real power and a potential in the tools, and they can be used for some of the best things you can possibly think of, but at the same time, they can bring you down very quickly as well. So I'm thinking of some of the emerging issues, and thinking that the differences in how we actually help kids along here. When we think about parenting strategies, the one big one in the 90s is like, every parent was told this: take a computer, put it in a public space in your house, and that will kind of take care of things. So you can walk by your kids to see what's happening. But that's not a reality when we start to see laptops, and of course, more and more everyone will have a device. This can lead to a very difficult situation when you're trying to monitor what's actually happening. Screen time, of course, also becomes a big issue. We've been dealing with screen time for a long time, but I mean, this thing actually exists, right? And I have a 3-year-old as well, and I think that how much screen time do you think a 3-year-old should have? It's not very much. Probably a lot less than most typical parents will actually do. But even thinking this is kind of entrapment, and if your kid is performing bad and you're working on something else, and maybe this thing, it can be very enticing, but it's not healthy for the most part. And even thinking the difference between screen time back in the day when we were worried about televisions, it's more than doubled since 1995. So from 3 hours to about 6.5, and that's average screen time. And of course, you've got to think that it's not just television, it's not just television programming, it's Netflix, it's Twitch, it's a lot of different things that kids are using, gaming. This all contributes to great screen time. Of course, some of this is also good screen time. It could be things that they're working on with schoolwork and so on. So not all screen time is necessarily bad. The American Association of Pediatrics suggests that under 18 months, avoid everything except video chatting. These are the revised. So under 18 months, it shouldn't be something that you're watching that's static, for instance. 18 to 24 can include some supervised high-quality programming. But what's really important at that age is make sure that there's explanations. You explain what's happening in the videos to how they actually associate with what's happening in the world. So there's a connection with that. Same thing with 2 to 5, up to 1 hour of high-quality programming, and again, explained by parents. Ages 6 and older, consistent limits. And it doesn't give you a real specific time, but limits are really incredibly important. And this is something, as you raise your kids, you have to continue to think about how important limits are to them and not to break these limits. And the limits can be fair and moderate at first and giving more time, but with responsibility and with your kid doing the right things over time, then you can increase the limits. But this is really a contract between you and your kids. Now, if we want to monitor it, it used to be much easier when you had the one computer in the living room. You could walk by it, or you could put like software like Net Nanny and so on. But those days are over. If you think about it, I mean, this is the memes of the 90s, which I think are great. You know, I want to get on the internet, but my mom was waiting on an important phone call. Or I want to call this girl from school, but I'm afraid her dad will answer the phone, right? The idea of even shared devices really changed the way that we think about monitoring the ability to actually see what kids are doing. So we've seen a disappearance of mediation over the few years. We used to have the house phone, and I'm assuming a lot of people have dropped the landline in some cases. Some people still hold on to it. But we've moved certainly from the house phone to mobile phone, from a shared computer to personal devices, from arcades, rinks, and malls to virtual communities. There's much fewer of those terrestrial spaces for kids to hang out in. Even thinking about sending of intimate images. One of the reasons it didn't happen before is because you had to go to the guy who basically developed your photographs, right? And so you're actually connecting with a human versus these things being digitized automatically. And this is one of the reasons, this privacy thing, that has actually emerged this whole culture of sexting. Radio, TV studios are personal live streams, and time delay to instant sharing, that no time delay. You didn't have to wait for an editor or a paper to publish. It's just instantaneous from your phone. And we think about some of the bad content out there, and because there's some kids out there, I won't mention it, but you can see the content really quickly. About 93% of girls and 62% of girls were exposed to some of the worst content available. And the problem is with that, as you expose kids more and more to this content, the more it actually leads to aggressive behavior. And this certainly translates into relationships, especially young boys, and what they ask of young girls. And this is something that we have to continue to monitor and be very cautious about, and how content actually affects that. And of course, there's a strong correlation between what kids see on the screen with self-concept. And we're seeing more and more, it's not necessarily just what kids see of stars online, whether it's the Kardashians or other stars out there, but it's also how they compare themselves to their peers, who often filter themselves, have taken 100 shots in the mirror, and they look absolutely wonderful just because they put a filter on and so on. There's no blemishes, there's nothing. And this is really hard on a kid's self-image. And of course, the type of stuff that we see today is much different, much more graphic, and much easier to access. Where you had to, do this in the past, where you had to go past a particular threshold at the store. This, of course, now has become the cyber sitters, the net nannies. But if you want to get rid of these, there's been a long culture over time for kids to bypass these things. Just Googling, or even in the past, if you Alta Vista, how to bypass this, or how to delete this, or how to get through it, or if you guess your parents' passwords on some of these things, you can get around them very quickly. And of course, there's technical ways to get around filters. Filters aren't necessarily a great solution. They have some short-term solution, but they're not the long-term solution. And kids find a way to get around them. So again, back to the idea of conversations. But there are some good tools to consider. Custodio is one that's fairly popular, and it's one that not only looks at what kids are doing online on multiple devices, so your desktop machine or else your iPhone, iPad. It doesn't necessarily block everything, but it does, and it doesn't monitor everything that kids are saying on their devices, but it will give you a readout of how much time they're spending on Snapchat, for instance, or a number of other supported apps. And that gives you an idea, and it also allows you to say, internet turns off at 9 o'clock, for instance. And of course, this is considering if it's Wi-Fi. If kids have their own data plan, that might be a different reality. Other tools like Circle, this is something that actually plugs into your router that allows you to monitor things from the router. So kids connecting through the router this is a pay per month thing. There's also, if you are more tech inclined, there's a tool called OpenDNS, which you can look at. It works basically with any router out there. You could, not all routers, but a lot of the supported routers, and you can do some free monitoring on here. This would cost you nothing a month, and it's free software as well. So there's a number of different tools that you can monitor what's happening on your network, but also restrict time when kids are connect, how long they connect, what apps they can connect when they connect. And so there's a lot of good things that you may want to look at. And if you have questions about this later, after I kind of run through, I'm very happy, at the end to talk specifically about these things. But what's also important is that it's not just, things on YouTube, for instance. There was a recent video, Logan Paul, who was a social media, most of your kids will know who this guy is. He goes into what's called the Japanese suicide garden and videotapes, a dead body. And then he was chastised on social media for doing this, but many kids were exposed to the videos. Millions and millions of kids were exposed to it, the videos. So even on YouTube, there can be content that can be very startling for kids and disrupting for them. So this idea, this is one of my favorite tweets ever. I'm in favor of internet filters. I just want to move them to the router to my students' heads. This is the ultimate goal that we have to have for our kids in school and in our homes. This idea that we need to help them understand that looking at particular content, participating in particular content is not a good thing. It's not good for us. But making that argument to kids is difficult, and we know that. So, but still work on it. It's worthy. It's worthy. Getting into bullying and mental health. This is something that is also incredibly important. And if you don't understand totally what bullying is, it's very similar to physical bullying. Consists of electronic messages that are intimidating or threatening. It might include threatening or aggressive emails, having your pictures posted online. This is probably one of the biggest ones, is having pictures of you that you may have had already online. They could be doctored. They could be pictures that you were in a relationship with someone, and these are posted online, shared online. Having one's identity used to send out or post embarrassing or threatening information. These are all parts of cyberbullying, which is quite common more and more. I'll kind of pass a couple of different examples. This is probably the worst case scenario. This is 5 teens in Nova Scotia. This was a sexting case. In this particular case, there's 5 boys who convinced 20 plus girls to send them photos, send them intimate photos. Those boys shared the photos in a Dropbox folder and shared it with a number of other people to see. Now, from a legality perspective, if those photos were shared from the boy and the girl who sent them in a one-to-one relationship, there's not much can be done legally. But once these photos are shared with a third party, that's when it gets very dicey legally, and there's some real restrictions, especially under Bill C-13. And that's something we can certainly look at. That's one of the biggest dangers to think about when we just saw a paper. There was just a published paper today that about 1 in 4 American kids will have been involved in some form of sexting. And so we're seeing that more, of course, in Canadian audiences as well. You may have heard of the story of Amanda Todd, similar situation where she basically sent out an image that was used against her. She was bullied by the image and eventually took her life. It was probably one of the saddest stories and one of the most notable stories to think about. Her mother's actually speaking in my class tomorrow night, and she has a really important story to share. So this documentary, this sextortion of Amanda Todd, is one that certainly is an eye-opener, thinking about how this can happen to young girls and how what are the worst case scenarios. This is not a common scenario, but it's something that certainly could be happen, and we have to always educate ourselves in this much longer way. So there are legal ramifications. So for instance, there is Bill C-13 that makes it illegal to distribute intimate images. There's imprisonment, seizure. Now there's reimbursement of costs incurred by the victim in removing the image, but what we know really is it's very difficult, if not impossible, to totally remove images off the internet. So something to be thought about. Identity and reputation is something I also want to get into as well, because that kind of leads from this particular space. Is kids sometimes just make bad choices online in terms of putting stuff out there that will certainly damage their reputation. This is a fairly notable one that for this girl, she didn't quite get that maybe taking a smiling selfie at this particular location was a bad choice. Or there's actually an entire Tumblr of kids who actually share smiling selfies at funerals, and there's other people who share these to public shame them for doing such a thing. An example of some girl being racist online, and this is the typical pathway. Someone does something racist online, and we know that at a young age this happens. I mean, at all ages this sort of thing happens. It's not acceptable that it happens, but now, of course, it's permanent. So you see this, and then what happens is they, in this particular case, someone noticed online that this person had said something racist. From that point, they what called doxed her. They found out more information about where she worked, and so on. And in this particular case, they noticed that she was an intern for a company, and from that, the people who wanted to shame her, I think I'm missing a slide here, but they actually contacted the company, and the company within a 4-hour span was able to relieve her from her internship. So you never want to see those particular situations. You don't want to see the racism, but at the same time, you don't want to see all that someone makes a bad mistake online and are punished for it, and in some cases, they never are able to recover. So this idea, we live in a world where a single post can define our lives for better or for worse. I think this is something that we have to think about. This is something we never had to deal with as parents. That we did something online and it was forever remembered. We were very lucky to have this ephemeral world where we did things and we might have done things that we weren't proud of, but for the most part, it didn't end up on YouTube or Instagram and wasn't shared with the world. Sometimes it was, but very, very rarely that it actually happened. And of course, you see examples like this. Harvard rescinded offers to incoming freshmen over hateful memes. So you see more and more universities saying we don't want you to come here anymore. Oh, I think my mother's phone is off. Going off. I know that duck sound. Other examples, the Toronto Star talks about forget the resume. Online profiles are the tool of young job seekers. The other trick here is having no digital identity online. Having nothing makes you feel odd. People are like, where have you been? We're living in the internet age. Where's your digital profile? And this is something that's really an interesting phenomenon. Even my undergraduate students who talk about dating, they won't date anyone that they can't find anyone online. Like they must be weird or something wrong with this person. They're a serial killer or something. Where it shouldn't be that way, but it seems you're the odd one out. But for the most part, from a job perspective, having nothing online disadvantages you today. So think about it in perhaps like a credit analogy. Having bad credit, of course, is bad. Having no credit is also bad, and it's the same with digital identity in many ways. So we can talk more about that as well if you want. The last piece I want to make sure I can pass this on to Coralee. Social media and mental health is something that we have to really pay more and more attention to as well, especially as kids spend more time online. It's no surprise, and a number of Facebook execs recently, for instance, are talking about how Facebook and other tools are ripping apart the fabric of society, that you've seen a polarization in the political sphere, for one, but it's also talking about this dopamine-driven tool. So ultimately what happens when you're on Facebook, what we normally do is we seek something that pleases us. For our entire lives, our minds are seeking articles or whatever else, food, whatever it might be, and pleases us in some way. And so what happens is if we post something online and we want, we're maybe posting a status or a photograph that we want other people to comment on in a positive way, whether it's comment or a like. And what's happened is since we've been able to like these things, dopamine turns to opioid very quickly. And so what we see is I post something, I get a quick fix. It's very much like a drug fix. And because those things are so close together, you keep doing it. And you end up in this loop of wanting more and more of this pleasure. Over time, you need to do more of it, and you're stuck with it. It doesn't give you the same pleasure as it did the first few times. And these social media companies really mess with that sort of idea. In fact, it's recently, now Instagram has not confirmed this or not, they've been blamed just recently. It's common knowledge of the industry that Instagram exploits this craving by strategically withholding likes. So think about this. What's happening is that teen girl who posts that selfie online, who's looking for some sort of being able to, have her peers perhaps comment favorably on this particular image. Instagram's, what they've been doing is actually holding back the likes. So someone might actually like it, but they withhold them for a while so that you stay on the app a bit longer. So kind of messing with your brain. So really kind of scary stuff that they do in some of these apps. So one of the downsides certainly of social media. We see that Twitter and Facebook addicts suffer withdrawal symptoms, something that we have to be thought about. Very much these things act very much like drugs. We see depression in many cases. A lot of it has to do with ourselves constantly comparing ourselves with other people on social media, when most of the things that we're comparing ourselves to are performances. They're not real. They're people that don't, for the most part, share the worst parts of their lives or the worst pictures of their lives. And it's something that we have to be very thoughtful about in terms of kids' mental health. And you're actually seeing kids take up this in positive ways. Some kids actually have 2 Instagram accounts, which I think is very helpful. One that they have for the world, the performance that they want people to see. And then they might have a private one that actually allows them to be more real. And I think that's an interesting idea, that they can look to their closest friends as real as possible. And I think the more we can get kids to be more real, the better it is for their health, ultimately. So that's one example. In fact, there's actually a tool that some kids are using. It's called Visco, and there's no likes and there's no comments. It's just basically sharing images. And a lot of kids find that really quite pleasing because it kind of takes them away of this idea where they have to have likes and metrics on every single thing out there. So one of the big questions that I'm helping kids to deal with is this idea is, how do we help young people develop self-worth that extends beyond the realm of likes, views, and retweets? And that's one of the big questions of our time, is thinking about, with all of these things that kind of affirm your identity out there, how do we make sure that kids feel the same way online, that we give them supportive channels, in the way that we used to do it, rather than having to depend on some of these tools. So to conclude a little bit, I'm not for getting rid of technology. I'm giving you like half an hour here. Probably that scared some of you from, maybe you want to go and burn your kids' phones or whatever it is. There's a lot of negative things out there, but we can't just let go of this stuff. We're hopefully here to be informed, to learn more about this, and hopefully later ask some questions, and perhaps we can get into this a bit deeper. But ultimately, think about it as driving lessons. We have to also get teachers and the community and parents on board to take up these tools, to learn about them a bit more, and to help our kids learn side by side. Because you've got wisdom that really needs to be shared with our kids, and they have maybe some of the tech knowledge, but together, hopefully, we can kind of work on this plan together. So I'm going to bring up Coralee, I'll ask Coralee to come up, and we'll kind of move from there. Sorry. Thank you.
So Alec, I'm just going to make sure I can get onto my... See, I'm that technologically unsavvy that I need some assistance here. So thanks very much. No. Well, I appreciate you being here today. My section of the evening is just to talk a bit about parenting, and I really see that as we've moved into this digitally focused world, we really have to be courageous parents. And my role with Saskatoon Public Schools is that I'm the coordinator of counselling and behaviour supports, and so I work primarily with counselors and other individuals in our schools who support students who have mental health concerns and other concerns as well. I also have a private practice, and one of the areas that I work in is in the area of addiction, and quite recently, my load has looked at a lot of individuals who are struggling with being connected to the internet and other digital sorts of platforms in a way that is causing them harm. So I appreciate you being here. I see this work as really, really important, and again have presented with Dr. Couros before, and have valued every time his work, his diligent study, and I think expanding on some of the things that he has to say through your questions after will be really helpful. So selfies. Here's a question. Between March 2014 and November 2016, were there more deaths related to shark attacks or selfies? Yeah, I hear the whispers. You're correct. It's selfies. Well, my grandma is going to be turning 105 in March. She has all her faculties. She doesn't know what a selfie is. If I were to give her that little piece of information, she would be absolutely shocked, in part because she doesn't understand what I'm saying, but also when I explained it to her, she would really struggle with that. We're in a new world. And in some ways, it requires us as parents to be very diligent and focused on, as Dr. Couros said, what's happening in the lives of our kids. Now, despite the fact that we live in a new world, kids, their developmental trajectory and how their brains develop have not changed. And so our role, while needing to be slightly different, still needs to help our kids develop in a healthy manner. And this has been known for generations, but of course, we need to discuss it in various forums like this, that parents, primary caregivers, and other supports are the individuals that will help kids mature in the best way possible. And although devices are useful, they have value in some ways, giving our kids over to online platforms and various devices doesn't bring about the emotional and social, psychological maturity that they need. So if you took a Psych 101 class, you will have heard about Dr. John Bowlby. He did the attachment studies. Well, back then they were called experiments. You're not allowed to use that term anymore. They're called studies, where he would have a mom and a baby. The mom would cuddle the baby. They would take the baby behind a wall, a mom behind the wall. A baby would cry. They would bring that baby back, and bonding would occur. The term bonding came out. And what Bowlby's determination at that time is that the baby needs the mom, and it was moms, to settle the nervous system, to build a connection, to feel soothed and safe and comforted and supported. And so his conclusion was that attachment or bonding is the lasting psychological connection between humans. Slightly different than what some of our kids tell us, that the lasting connection is whatever they did on their device 5 minutes ago. But the truth is, it is our connection with human beings in a very deep and intimate way that actually helps to build brains and actually helps to develop emotional maturity. And as time has moved, what the research continues to show us is that attachment isn't just for babies. Bowlby's work was really important, it was seminal, but the truth is, as kids age, as their brains develop, in, out, from the brainstem up to the prefrontal cortex, we know that they need soothing, supportive, nurturing, primary and secondary supports in order to mature. The sad reality is that many parents start to feel displaced by the digital. They have a desire to connect with their kids, but in fact there's this thing, this almost intangible thing, that is between them and their kid. Some parents feel like they don't know where they fit, and they might certainly, as Alec identified, be concerned, legitimately concerned, with those things that their kids are exposed to online, and also that influence of peers. The Amanda Todd case is one that I've looked at extensively, and certainly one where peers played a substantial role. With centuries of parenting, parents have had this internal maternal nudge. This is what we're made to do as parents. We have this thing inside us that's calling us to nurture. Provide limits. Provide limits, real limits, kind limits, but limits. Monitor interactions and be diligent about those things that build kids' wellness. We know that routines, rituals, and rhythms are incredibly important to the developing brain. And sometimes these rituals and routines, rhythms, get disrupted because of the things that kids are filling their days with. It's very difficult to get adequate sleep if you're sleeping with your smartphone under your pillow. Now, kids, although they sometimes don't appear like they need us, parents, supporters, primary and secondary caregivers, they absolutely do. And in fact, sometimes, and I've worked with teenagers for a lot of my career. I worked with young offenders, actually, for about 10 years, and spent a lot of time in various custody facilities, both young offender and adult facilities. But most of the kids that I worked with, they had these strategies that pushed the adults away. They were not particularly pleasant. They used a lot of foul language. They were very quick to find one's faults and push the adults away. But the truth was, even those kids absolutely craved adult support and nurture. In fact, when we got down to the nitty-gritty with those kids, they desired it in such a deep way, often more than the kids that routinely got that kind of support. Positive attention, affection, nurture is desperately needed by our kids, but sometimes they push us away. They push back. They depend on the digital and replace some of the richness that comes from positive, healthy, pro-social, interpersonal relationships using the digital. Now, again, there are many, many reasons why the digital is beneficial. It can be helpful, practical, certainly talking about the dopamine and that feedback loop connection, absolutely. Something that Dr. Couros mentioned, there's pleasure. There's pleasure. And it may not be just Facebook who's strategically setting things up, or Instagram who's strategically setting up. There's other reasons and other ways that people gain pleasure through online use. And the reality is, we're not going to change it. Modern society isn't going to change the present circumstances that we live in using online and digital platforms. Of course, as have already been mentioned, what can happen is there's the downside. For me, working with kids and working with adults who help kids, the thing that's most troubling to me is when online relationships completely or almost completely replace other relationships. And it's quick and easy for this stuff to get out of hand without course corrections and without limits. But brain science, especially concerning young people growing into adults, absolutely need adults in their lives. Dr. Bruce Perry does a great deal of work. He's out of the Child Trauma Academy. Now, we're not talking about child trauma per se, but one of the terms that he uses when he talks about brain development is this idea of co-regulation. So my nervous system, as a healthy, hopefully, pro-social nervous system, is co-regulating my child's nervous system, my teenager's nervous system. This is a very important and healthy role for me as a parent. If I'm in a different room from my child, I'm not able to do that. If I'm not connected to my child interpersonally, it's very difficult to do that. Of course, we know that online use, digital platforms, they can be very habit-forming. And another aspect about the developing brain is that it is much more plastic than our old brains. And so the truth is, those repetitive actions take less, there's a less repetitive action needed as far as likes, as far as responding to feedback from others, for there to be very strong pathways built in the brain. So kids return back to the same thing again and again and again. So we can disconnect physically, but it's also very easy to disconnect emotionally. And so being diligent, being aware, is one of our first steps in order to maintain that connection with our kids. So we know our kids have been raised with this digital mindset. This is their world. We're not going to change it. We might want to go back and say, the good old days. It doesn't make any sense. It is an absolutely ludicrous concept to kids, even quite young kids who don't know the full gamut of what's out there. From my perspective, I really believe it's incumbent upon us to understand healthy development. And I appreciated what Dr. Couros indicated up on the screen. And he talked about the developmental levels and what's recommended for online use. Those kinds of guides are important. Again, they're guides. We do our best with what we have, but they're guides. What we know is that kids' brains don't fully mature until about the mid-20s. Of course, give or take, that's a range. But when we consider that, and some of the influences and the content and the interpersonal interactions that occur online, it's something for us to be aware of. Cause and effect doesn't show up early. You may have asked your teenager, why did you do that? And what's the typical response? I don't know. Okay, so what is the reason for that? Well, part is sometimes that, they're covering up, but the truth is, many don't know. Impulse control is not fully developed until adulthood. A full cause and effect understanding isn't developed until adulthood. And for some of us, maybe it's not yet developed, right? You can see this in people. And yet we give our kids one of the most powerful tools in the world, and their brains just aren't fully ready to use it with wisdom, with discernment, with good judgment, which is why us staying very connected in the relationship with our kids is so critical. When kids are born, they start to develop language. We consider them what we call right-brained. So they're much more sensory-oriented, emotional, not in a negative way, but connected more to the emotional realm. They see the big picture. Once they start to go to school, we develop more this left brain, sequential, logical, orderly, that kind of thinking. But that kind of thinking takes a while. When kids are spending an enormous time online, this natural trajectory breaks down. The things that they need to do, innovate, be creative, play, engage. And I'm not saying that some of that can't happen online, but the sensory-oriented development that's tactile and kinesthetic in nature is absolutely critical for developing brains. The right brain tends to be more influenced as well. It holds on to pictures. It holds on to images. Emotions are very, very intense. And so that is another reason for us to be cautious and careful when we support our children and teach our children around online use. Of course, adolescent bodies tend to grow faster than adolescent brains. So you might have an enormous, big body, A 15-year-old who is 6'2", but his reasoning, his judgment, his logic is not necessarily there like an adult. And so sometimes we get a bit duped. You know, there's this big body, and sometimes he's talking coherently, he's saying what I want him to say, but then the judgment, the things that go on to live streaming, for example, are not well thought through. One of the things that happened in the Amanda Todd case, of course, is that there was a peer-based hierarchy that was developed. And of course, the bullying that was associated with that ended up in a horrific catastrophe. And we know that often peers develop hierarchies very quickly. Happened when I was in high school, but it didn't happen digitally. It happened face-to-face or behind someone's back. In this kind of a culture, it happens in a completely different way and an almost intangible way. We also know that too much alone time for the developing brain is hard on the nervous system. We're built to be together. This is how we are. This is how we're made. We're built to be together. And so bringing kids together, being together as families in places where there's nurturing support is incredibly helpful for development. Some of the things that we can do. So we can absolutely role model healthy interpersonal relationships. We can demonstrate that there's pleasure in being together. There's fun being together. We don't have to say that message as much as we have to role model it. Kids sort of care about what we say, but not that much, to be perfectly honest. They care more about what we do. And so role modeling healthy interpersonal relationships is valuable. And for us, I mean, I work full-time and I have a private practice, and I do all my communication via, email or some other method. And so it's easy for my kids to see me online a lot. But I know for myself, I need to be diligent in role modeling time away from my devices, not picking up my cell phone constantly. What does it look like to have some downtime, some disconnection time? And then take time to discuss in your family openly and honestly, in a developmentally appropriate way, what activities build the brain. And there are a number of online activities that build the brain, as well as many, many activities that are not digitally based that build the brain and assist with positive, healthy emotions. So in order to talk to our kids, we need a couple of things. First, we need to pay attention to what's going on. What are you noticing? Whether it's mood, whether it's friendships, notice, be aware, be attuned. And the second is joining that with empathy. Growing up is tricky. It's always been tricky. I think it's probably even more difficult than it has been. And so expressing empathy for the difficulties, for the misjudgments, for the things that happen that are hurtful is vital. That doesn't mean that you agree, but when a kid has made a mistake, it hurts, it's scary, it's painful. And our empathy, our ability to say, I get it, like that seems really awful, is an open window, is an opportunity for our kids to join with us, and we have the possibility of making enormous inroads. When we lead compassionately, understanding that this is a tricky time, that there's lots of competing values, there are many competing influences. This helps our kids. One, it shows them what compassionate leaders are like, but two, it creates safety. so that our kids will come to us, so they'll talk to us, so perhaps once in a while they'll even ask for advice. Compassionate leaders reduce power struggles, and I know that power struggles are so connected with this online use. There's this first step of acknowledgement. We need to acknowledge what's going on. It's easy to just judge what's going on. That's bad, and that's bad, and that's bad, and that's bad. And maybe it is. But acknowledging without judgment tends to lower the defenses for kids. We need to acknowledge as well that sometimes kids are stuck in these power differentials with peers that put them emotionally at risk, sometimes physically at risk, certainly emotionally at risk. And acknowledge that we're there to help them walk through that. Not necessarily to solve those problems. Parents getting into those problems can be really difficult from a peer perspective, but at least we're there to support. So first is to acknowledge what's going on, and second is, in a compassionate way, state what your limits are. Parents need to have limits. Limits actually help kids feel safe. People like Gordon Neufeld, Gabor Mate, Bruce Perry, Dan Siegel, Tina Payne Bryson, many, many people who are well noted in the literature promote the idea of healthy, supportive, connected limits. Of course, when limits aren't kept, we need to respond with course corrections. It can be gentle, it can be kind, but it needs to be firm. We need to set appropriate parameters with our kids. Some strategies, the 3 C's that we can use as compassionate leaders, is when we're in a difficult situation with our kids around technology, is really to be calm. Calm doesn't mean neutral. Neutral is this kind of flat face. Nobody knows how to read neutral. That's not helpful for kids. They're constantly trying to figure us out. When we're confident and we're peaceful, we're able to roll with the things that they give us. It's easy to want to really freak out, and I get it, because there's scary stuff out there. But that doesn't help our kids. When we put our kids in a state of alarm because we're alarmed, when our amygdala is firing like crazy, that doesn't help our kids. Our job as parents, even though this is difficult stuff, is to remain calm and to roll with the things that are happening. We might be upset, we might be discouraged, but when we roll with resistance, when we roll with the things that they're giving us, we actually work through some of the defenses that are getting in our communication way. Be consistent. And this is tricky. We're all busy. Consistency takes effort, it takes time, it's absolutely critical. Sometimes we just use this broken record technique, which is to repeat the same limit in slightly different ways, not being exasperated. I know it's easy to go there, but the limit just has to continue to be repeated. And then one of the things that I really encourage parents to do is connect using proximity. In particular, I encourage parents not to power over their kids, not to talk down to them. I'm short, so I don't have that problem. But I mean, connecting diagonally or side to side is a way to reduce alarm in a child's nervous system, an adolescent's nervous system. It's much less threatening, and it's more likely to get a connected response. Often, I'll encourage parents to go for a drive, pick up a drink, have a conversation, be together, be parallel, be connected. One of the other things that I encourage parents to do is to establish digital-free zones or time frames. We know that when kids get poor sleep, mood is affected. And anxiety is associated with mood difficulties, with poor sleep, anxiety and depression. And this third point is difficult to describe in a slide or a part of a slide, but I often encourage parents to incorporate a digital reduction plan. It's a bit more complex than described here, but really is very, very minimally reducing the amount of time. It is absolutely true that if people have been using a great degree of technology, if they've been exposed to a lot of time, that there are physiological symptoms like one would have if withdrawing from a substance. Tremors, panic attacks, heart palpitations. I never encouraged families to go cold turkey. There's often a physiological response, and there's definitely an emotional response. So just to sum, kids' brains, they're still under construction, and they continue to need this balance between non-digital time and digital time. We're not going to get away from that. But it's this focus on balance, acknowledgement that the brain develops best when connection with adults and in a healthy, connected way with peers and others that is face-to-face. As much as possible, and Dr. Couros mentioned that it's difficult to monitor, but as much as possible, know what your kids are doing online. If not what they're doing online, when they're online, being connected around them when they are using, when they're online. The other thing to encourage is that peers should never replace parents. We have kids trying to parent kids, kids going to each other because of their really big life problems. It's our job as parents to be connected to our kids and for us to parent our kids. And then parents as compassionate leaders are really needed, especially given our current situation in the world. We need to be courageous. We need to know what's going on out there, and we need to diligently work to stay connected to our kids. So thank you.
So we do have some time for questions. I don't know how we're going to do this. So basically, I have a mic that I will run out to the audience while you guys can stay up there and answer questions. So anybody have a question? Okay, go on.
Looking at.
You want to repeat the question a little bit in your answer too, just so it goes on the street?
How do you look at the phone without being overbearing or that you're being nosy, I guess? Would be? Yeah. Thoughts on that?
Well, I do have some thoughts. Ideally, it's starting as young as possible, and for some of us, it's gone too far too fast. But starting young, which is, this is a family device. Not that you don't take primary ownership of it, but guess what? I get to see what's on your device. Now that works if you start them young with that. It's more difficult if now they're 15 and you say, guess what? I get to see your phone. But if that isn't your case, for those who have younger children, which is starting quite young, discussing how you will look at the device, how you will talk about what's going on, how it will be part of your daily routine is really helpful. When they're older, I think part of it is keeping very emotionally connected as much as possible and inviting them to share maybe something that's innocuous, but something. building that connection, building the opportunity to connect once in a while around their device. It doesn't mean that you can necessarily always monitor to the degree you'd want, but there might be some subtle strategies.
Sure. To add to that, I have the same passwords my kids have. And so they can go into my device, I can go into their device, and that's one of the ways that we've done it. It's just they can nose around on my device if they wanted to. My oldest is 13. We've discussed, and we've actually had this conversation where if they ever change their passwords, we'd have it in an envelope somewhere. Not that I necessarily go into their phone, and this is a strategy that you often hear, is that there'd be passwords in an envelope. And if you ever have to go in there, you go in there. But it's not that you know the password and then you're actively looking, it's just that you can look at any time. And if you randomly check and if you can't get it to that phone, into that device, then the trust has been broken. So it's at that level, it's just getting onto the phone for you being able to get onto it. And I think that's most parents don't have to go beyond that. So I think that's part of it, but I really do think that starting young is really important, that there's an expectation that I can just say, hey, Rain, give me your phone, and I can look through it, and then I can hand it back. That's just sort of the way it is, yeah. So hopefully you started young. I don't know, yeah.
Got to get out of the light there so I can see. Any other questions? Oh, we have a question up front.
What is her name?
Oh, okay. I'll tell you in a minute.
Difficult question, and I'll try to be respectful of your daughter here, but grade 9 son, and just being aware of the adult images and things that are available, clearly no way I can stop him from finding it. The degree of things that are available, obviously, I mean, you had an image of the original Playboy magazine, which was scandalous at the time. By now, it's almost innocent, you know, and so sorry, from the Sears catalog to Playboy to more and more things. So, you know, what strategies, you know, it's not just I know he's going to see it, but how do you, what strategies for when's the time to introduce it, when's the time to talk about it? Is there a mild version of it, and then what, I mean, you read about the impact for young men and their expectations of the girls they know or meet, right? They think that's reality. Also the self-image thing. I mean, it's a huge question, but any practical tips you might have?
I can start with that a little bit. Actually, some of the biggest sites that provide adult images have some of the best stats in terms of what people actually look up, and it's startling to see what's become the norm in terms of what's actually being viewed. And the reason I had that Playboy magazine up is that it's no longer your grandpa's Playboy anymore. It's no longer that reality that it's soft core relations, I guess. It's much more extreme, much more violent. Anything can be found very quickly. And that absolutely, in the literature, it reflects that exposure to this, there's a different demand in relationships, especially one of dominance, of male dominance in these particular relationships, and expectations for particular acts that are very common in pornography in particular. So that is, you know, so stepping back, when we know, and I guess, I mean, this, I'm not speaking for the school district, certainly, but the literature in terms of meta-studies would look at, even for instance, sexting. When we talk about, when we say don't sext, kids aren't stopping. But when we talk about this idea of how can we help you understand that if you put images out there, like it's more of like a safer sexting approach. We're not acknowledging or saying that this is something that we want you to do. It just, if you are sharing images, know these things. Know that there are laws. Know that there are safer ways to share things. Know that, you know, for the most part, there needs to be absolute trust. And then, and the meta studies that have been done, where those types of tactics, where we talk very directly, with kids around what's out there, like in a very upfront voice, but not to get into the gritty details, but to say there are images out there. People share images quite frequently. This has become normalized. Like, how do we talk about you being safe out there? And for the most part, abstinence-only approaches in terms of sexting don't work as well as, at least that's what the literature says, versus the idea of how do we be safer around this. So to give other examples, there was Jennifer Lawrence. She had her phone hacked. Remember Jennifer Lawrence, of famous, Hollywood actor? Had her phone hacked. She had photos taken from her, and it wasn't her fault. So she shared images with her boyfriend, and she actually had a Cosmopolitan or Vogue interview. And the interview, she said something like, people shamed her, and she shouldn't have been shamed. I mean, that's the one thing that was wrong, and I would defend her to the day. Like, if she wants to have images with her partner, that seems to be the norm these days. But what she said was, what she said though to like all of her viewers, everyone who looks up to her, she said, if I don't send my boyfriend photos, then he's just going to look at porn. And it's just sort of this idea that there's this if-then statement, this idea that if I don't do this, if I don't do these things for this other person, then they're going to look at something more extreme. And I think it's really important for us to understand what sort of messages are we giving to young people. So I think that idea of getting back to respectful relationships is so incredibly important in all of this. But we can't talk about respectful relationships if we don't talk about these things in a much more honest way. And I think that's always been the dilemma of talking about these particular issues. Some parents, because of beliefs, whatever beliefs they may be, whether they're moral, religious, otherwise, don't want to speak in that particular way. But I think it's important that we recognize that there is a power in honesty, certainly. I don't know if you want to take it even further. Yeah. So I don't know if I'm giving any strategy, but I guess, trying to think, there is a lot of, there's a lot of power in being upfront about some of these things and, taking them on head on without having to get into the gritty details around a lot of the stuff. But we know at a very young age, kids are exposed to far more extreme things than we've ever been exposed to. And it's affecting them psychologically, it's affecting their relationships.
Just one other thing. And I guess talking about respect, not when the crisis hits. So this pre-teaching idea. So how do we, respect in our family, how do we respect our friends starting really young? How to have discussions about healthy emotional relationships. And these things grow with kids when we start to describe, respectful relationships between friends, between partners, between spouses. And we start young, before the crisis hits, before the dilemma hits. Then there's language to hold on to. Then we introduce the more challenging concepts and use explicit language without being, risque in any way. Then kids understand, they have something to hang it on. They understand, oh, this is about respect. Oh, this is about how I treat my friend. This is how I treat myself as someone who is to be respected. This is how I treat, my partner or my spouse. So starting young, talking about emotional connection in a healthy way, emotional development, how relationships need to be respectful from early on before the crisis hits. Once the crisis hits, people's defenses get up, and we tend to be more stressed out, and how we communicate isn't usually as effective as if we can teach some of these concepts.
It's good to know that the request for boys for images is happening quite frequently in grades 6, 7, 8. For photos, and it's happening in those particular cases. So we see more and more. I think it was my older daughter, grade 7, it happened for her where someone asked, and luckily I could say, hey, principal, can I come in to talk to the school? I think it's really important. Once we hear those things, we need to talk to schools and say we need to talk to this entire school about this. Talk to the grades, because if it's happening to someone it's happening at a much greater level. Like let's deal with this very quickly and understand like boys need to be given. In particular, boys and girls need to be given the talk, but there's slightly different talks for the most part in terms of what is asked and what we should provide in those particular situations, because there's a real big power dynamic, and again, more and more boys are expecting this at a young age.
No? Okay.
The other day, my son had his friends over, and I noticed his phone floating around between his friends, and they were all on his phone. I wonder if you could address that issue of a phone being picked up and transferred around to all kinds of people, and what you might have to say about that.
Well,
I was very alarmed.
What do you think was happening? Is that, like, your son gave permission for these boys to look at his phone?
Well, no, there were just a few people in the basement, and the one picked up his phone and was on it and using it, and I don't know if he logged into it. I don't know. My son didn't seem to care, wasn't worried. I was.
Yeah.
I thought,
what were you worried about the most in terms of private images being shared? Or
I don't know. I just
Okay.
kind of reacted like, okay,
yeah.
this is not a good idea.
Right.
Basically, I don't know what information the friends extract from the phone. I don't know what they do with that information. I don't know. I trust my son. I think he trusts his friends.
Yeah.
But I reacted fairly strongly with him about it. I just wondered what your comments are about that.
Well, I think it's an important, like, I obviously I can only speak very generically because I don't know what was being shared or what the relationship with
No,
those
I mean,
boys are.
it was just the phone, just
Yeah.
kind of drifting around between
Right.
friends, and it seemed very casual. They're all just sharing each other's phone.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you could say in this particular situation is that one of the key areas of bullying is when a particular image or passwords are broken into. Like, I talk to kids all the time about, just getting into someone's account. Like, when you hear some kid's phone has been hacked, it's most likely 99.9% of the time hasn't been hacked through some technical measure. It's because what they call social engineering. So basically, they know this kid's most likely passwords, and they get into it, and they forward something. They might see, someone, maybe messages to a girl back and forth, and they take that screen cap and send it to all their friends, and they ridicule it. So I think it's important for kids to think about personal devices as just that. They are personal devices, and those people who actually are on those phones should be people who they trust. When it's being passed out a bit more casually, then the message should be, maybe like sometimes these devices are, like an iPad in classroom. Maybe there's nothing on there that's of personal note, so I don't know if that's the case. But when they become more personal, like other than allowing my kids to look at it, because it's all work related. For the most part, if it was, but for me to give it to a colleague, I probably wouldn't do that. Just there's emails, for instance, that maybe not every person reads the same way, and there's different audiences that you give it to. Things are taken out of context. So I think maybe talking about how it is a personal device. These are personal devices, and they're meant to be personal in that respect. Not just because you can personalize them, but there's personal information on them as well.
Yeah.
So.
I basically told him to keep his password to himself.
Yeah.
Change his password every so often.
It's good practice. Yeah, password protection is one of the biggest issues around bullying, because kids will I watch my 13-year-old. They're friends sometimes with her friends, and some days they're not friends, and there's all that drama. I don't know who's friends with who. And on any given day, you could use that information to hurt someone, and it's not good at all. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know, being a classroom teacher, the grade 7 and 8 was my class. Kids would often share their locker passwords, their what they log into, and then all of a sudden on the printer there would be something inappropriate coming off, and you'd go and talk to the student that printed it, because that's all logged, and it wasn't that student, but because they gave their password out, now we don't know who did it. So we always have those conversations about making sure that you don't share that kind of stuff. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank Coralee and Alec. every time they come, it's great, just the way it all fits together so nicely. It's just such a great thing. So I'd like to thank them again.
If anyone has questions down the road, there's my email address. Feel free to use it anytime, and be happy to take questions even afterwards if you like. Sure, thanks.
And this was recorded tonight, so we will give Cody, the principal, the link, and we could put it on the school's website if you'd like to go back and read it later. Thanks again. Drive safe.